There is a crack in your foundation right now, and you cannot see it. Not in your house, in something older, quieter, and far more expensive to repair than any wall. It started small, a hairline shift, invisible to the eye, the kind of movement that never shows up in a photograph. And every year you ignore it, it widens a little more, until one day the whole structure settles into a shape you never designed and never approved. That is what is happening to your money, right now, while you sleep, while you work. While you go about your ordinary Tuesday, certain that the plan you built years ago is still standing exactly where you left it. Most people believe they are protected because they have a plan, a number on a spreadsheet, 70% stocks, 30% bonds, a tidy little blueprint drawn up years ago, filed away, trusted completely, almost like a document that finishes its job the moment it's signed. But a blueprint is not a foundation. A blueprint is just paper. The real structure, the one holding up everything you have worked for, everything you are counting on to hold your weight later in life, has been moving under your feet the entire time, and nobody ever told you to check. Here is the part that stings. You did everything you were told. You built the plan, you funded it faithfully month after month. Maybe you even glance at it once a year around the holidays, the way people check smoke detectors on the same weekend every fall. Calendar discipline, it feels responsible. It feels like control. It even feels, in a strange way, like peace of mind. But a foundation does not crack on a schedule. It cracks when pressure crosses a threshold, and pressure has never once cared what month it is. While you wait for your once-a-year inspection, the ground underneath your portfolio is already shifting quietly without asking permission. Stocks climb faster than bonds in a strong year, and your careful 70-30 split slowly becomes 75-25, then 80-20 without a single decision from you. Nobody signed off on that. Nobody sent a notice. It just happened the way rust happens. The way settling happens, slowly, then suddenly all at once. Usually right before the ground gives way during exactly the kind of downturn a well-built structure was supposed to survive without damage. Picture it in plain numbers because the shift is easier to feel that way. A person builds a portfolio at 70% stocks and 30% bonds, satisfied, certain the ratio will hold. 5 years pass without a single correction. Stocks have simply done what stocks do over a strong stretch, climbed harder than bonds quarter after quarter, and now that same portfolio sits closer to 80% stocks. On paper, it still wears the label 70-30. In reality, it is carrying meaningfully more risk than the person ever agreed to. Nobody decided that on purpose. The ground simply moved while the label stayed the same, and the label is what most people trust. And here is the part almost nobody says out loud. By the time your calendar reminder finally goes off, the structural damage may already be done. You are not preventing the crack at that point. You are simply documenting it, 12 months too late, standing over a foundation that already shifted while you were looking somewhere else entirely. This is not a story about greed, and it is not a story about chasing bigger returns. This is a story about something far more uncomfortable to admit, the realization that the very system you built to protect yourself has a blind spot baked directly into its design. A blind spot with a name, a shape, and a fix. And once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it again. So let's look at the ground itself. Think about how a real foundation is actually monitored by people whose job is to prevent collapse, not just document it. Structural engineers don't inspect a bridge every January regardless of the weather, the traffic load, or the season. That would be almost careless. Instead, they install tolerance thresholds. The structure is allowed to shift, a little naturally, because some movement is healthy and expected. But the moment the drift crosses a defined boundary, a specific and measurable line drawn in advance, something responds immediately. Not next quarter, not at the next scheduled visit. Now, while the crack is still small enough to matter. Financial engineers have quietly used the exact same logic for decades, even though almost nobody explains it in plain language. It is called corridor rebalancing, and it behaves nothing like the calendar habit most households were ever taught to trust. Instead of asking, "What day is it?" a corridor approach asks a sharper, more honest question. How far has the ground actually moved from where I built it to stand? You set a band around your target allocation, 5 percentage points in either direction, for example, and you leave the structure alone as long as it stays inside that band. No unnecessary trades, no unnecessary taxes, no touching something that was never actually broken in the first place. But the instant your allocation drifts beyond that boundary, the instant the crack widens past the safe threshold you defined, the plan responds on its own timeline, not the calendar's timeline. That is the entire secret hiding inside threshold rebalancing. It was never about checking more often. It was always about acting at the right moment and staying perfectly still every other day in between. Now here is where most people get it backward, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, because the instinct feels so reasonable on the surface. The instinct is to believe that tighter control means checking constantly, trading constantly, reacting to every small tremor the moment it appears. That instinct is expensive, and it is expensive in a way that rarely shows up as a single obvious line item. A corridor set too narrow behaves like a homeowner who calls a structural engineer every single time a door sticks in humid weather. You end up paying for inspections you never needed, and worse, inside a taxable account, every unnecessary trade can trigger a bill from the tax authority that quietly erodes the very stability you were trying to protect in the first place. The fix, applied carelessly, becomes its own form of slow damage. But a corridor set too wide is just as dangerous, only in the opposite direction, and this side of the mistake is far more common because it looks like patience. It lets the crack run for years, completely unmonitored, until the day the ground finally gives out during exactly the kind of downturn a properly protected portfolio was supposed to absorb without breaking. Too tight bleeds you slowly through friction and unnecessary taxes. Too wide bleeds you silently through neglect. And the correct width was never a fixed number borrowed from a magazine article or a stranger's spreadsheet. It has to match your own foundation, your own risk tolerance, your own account type, your own true cost of trading. This is also why two households, side by side, can follow the same general idea and end up with two completely different outcomes. A younger investor, decades from needing the money, can usually tolerate a wider corridor because time itself absorbs the tremors. Someone closer to drawing on that money cannot afford the same width because there is far less time left to recover if the ground shifts hard in the wrong direction. The corridor is not a universal setting. It is a personal one, calibrated the same way an engineer calibrates a threshold to the specific building, not to buildings in general. There is one more piece almost nobody explains clearly, and it may be the part that separates a portfolio built for lasting peace from one quietly built for regret. You do not always need to sell anything to correct the drift. New contributions, dividends, even routine withdrawals can be directed toward whichever side of the structure has fallen behind, reinforcing the foundation from the inside instead of tearing anything down to rebuild it. No forced sale during a bad week. No unnecessary tax event triggered out of habit. Just quiet, deliberate redirection, the way an engineer reinforces a settling wall from within, rather than demolishing it and starting over. This single shift, corridor over calendar, redirection over forced selling, is often the entire difference between a portfolio that drifts for half a decade completely unnoticed, and one that stays exactly where it was built to stand year after year, without you having to think about it every single day of your life. Picture two versions of the same person, 5 years apart, standing on the exact same starting ground. One followed the calendar faithfully. Once a year, right on schedule, they glanced at the numbers, nodded with quiet satisfaction, and closed the laptop, never realizing how far the structure had already shifted underneath them while they weren't looking. The other set a threshold once calmly, without drama, and then let the plan defend itself day after day. No panic, no obsessive checking. No 12-month blind spot waiting to be discovered too late. Just a structure that corrects itself the moment it actually needs to and stays completely silent the rest of the time. The difference between those two people was never intelligence. It was never luck, and it was never the market's mood that year. It was one decision, made quietly and early, the decision to stop watching the calendar and start watching the ground itself. Because the goal was never to grow faster than everyone else, or to outperform some benchmark for bragging rights. The goal was always simpler and steadier than that, to still be standing upright and level on solid ground, when everyone who trusted a calendar finally looks down one day and notices the crack they missed for years. And once your foundation is finally being monitored the right way, there is a second, quieter question worth carrying with you, one most people never think to ask until it's already too late. What happens to that same structure the moment you stop adding weight to it and start drawing weight away, the way retirement eventually asks of every portfolio? That is a very different kind of pressure on the same foundation, and it deserves its own careful conversation.